Welcome to another wonderful Susannah Calloway audiobook. We are excited to have you with us. Before we begin the story, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. This allows us to continue adding free clean Western romance audiobooks for you to enjoy. The following title is copyrighted by Susannah Calloway, Western romance author. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and enjoy the story. The Bounty Hunter and the Runaway Bride. Chapter 1. After 10 long years, Mason had returned home. In his mind, the years had built a physical barrier between him and this house. Not that he was feeling unwelcome, not at all. His ma was the sweetest, best woman in the world, and she was doing her utmost to make him feel like he'd never left home at all. But he had left home. And he'd gotten used to the road. 10 years were a lot to leave behind. You sit down right now, Mason, his ma said firmly, manhandling him into one of the chairs by the dining table. I'm still prepparin' the breakfast, and what kind of ma would I be to send you out without eating? Have you been workin' without eating breakfast all these years? It's a wonder you haven't fallen dead yet. I'm a grown man. I can decide when I eat breakfast and when I don't, he groused, though he sat down obediently. A man didn't disobey his mother when she was wishing to feed him. Mason hadn't had his ma's cooking in 10 years, after all. But still, he was not a boy anymore. Of course, you can, his ma said, her tone dripping with doubt. That's why you wanted to go out there to work under the sun for several hours without a single slice of bread in your stomach. Now shush, Mason. I'm makin' some coffee to tide you over until the bread is done. All right, Mason relented. I'm not gonna complain about being fed. I've had enough of jerky, ma, and I think I'd die for a proper stew, one made by a woman in her kitchen instead of burly men around a fire. His mother laughed. You say that, but back before you left, you used to like your father's stews more than mine. Oh, but he puts more meat in it, you used to say. Ma, can't you get sick more often just so he'll have to cook more? Mason's smile dimmed, and so did his mother's. They stayed in silence a few moments, both of them mourning. It had been a little bit over a month since Mason's father had passed away. It had been a bout of illness that had done him in, which was a more peaceful way than the sort Mason had seen so much out in his world of bounty hunting, but there was still something utterly terrible about it. Since Henry had died of an illness, Mason had no one to blame, no one to hunt or shoot, no way to let out his grief. It was no one's fault. That was why Mason had come back home after so many years. He would never regret leaving to become a bounty hunter, but he did regret the little time he'd had with the man. Since they had taken him in when he had been 13, he'd had only a few years with the man before he had left to become a bounty hunter. But those few years had been more than enough to create a sure bond between them. Mason would see to it that he had many, many more years with his mother. Say, Mason, his mother started after a few minutes of silence. Do you think you'll stay long here? I'm not trying to pressure you, mind. I know you got to leave when you feel like you got to leave. But I'm wonderin', boy, what your plans are. I can't take care of the ranch alone, couldn't even if my knees weren't making themselves known more and more each day that passes. So, we have to figure out what we're gonna do. He noticed she was fidgeting with something, but from where he was sitting, he couldn't see what. Later, he would learn it was the first version of an advert his adopted mother had written, discarded for a smudge in the corner. She'd placed the advert at the store in town shortly after Henry had passed. It was for a live-in companion. Hilda had been afraid of being all alone, and she still was. She never knew how long her adopted son would stay. Another woman around wouldn't help the ranch, of course, they needed a cowhand or two for that. But it would help Hilda's heart, and her loneliness. I don't know, he said honestly. But I'm not leaving you so soon, Ma. Don't worry. We'll work things out, all right? Maybe I will get a cowhand later on, but I don't think I will stay away much, at least these first few months. We don't have to think about it right now. All right, his mother said softly. I'm goin' to trust you on this. It's your ranch now, after all. Maybe, He told himself as he inhaled an aroma he hadn't encountered in years, that of his mother's special breakfast loaf of bread. Maybe I'll even want to stay for good. I've saved enough with the bounties. Maybe I'll meet somebody and build something with her. Maybe I'll finally stop wanting to leave all the time and want to settle down instead. But even as he thought it, he knew himself. He knew that sooner rather than later, he would get the urge to go out on the road again. "Stella, I had some tea made for you," Sherman Marlow said. It was obvious he was trying with all his limited patience to sound gentler than usual, but he was failing, and even if he had managed to sound as saintly as possible, Stella wouldn't have let him into the room. It was true that she was his wife, and he should have had full access to the room she was staying in, but they had just married a week ago, and Stella had found herself utterly incapable of giving the man the intimacy needed for the child he so desperately wanted right now. Maybe being a mail-order bride was a bad idea, she thought. She sighed, putting her head in her hands, and tried to affect a sick voice. "I'm sorry, Sherman," she said with a fake cough. "I'm still feeling so poorly. The last thing I want is to get you sick. Can you leave the tea outside? I will get it in a moment." There was a pause, then an explosive sigh. "Stella, it's been a week that we've been married," he said, annoyance and anger coming through clearly in his voice now. "I'm not saying you're to blame, you're just sick, but I'm getting tired of all this. I'm not so young anymore, and you know why I married you. And we haven't even." She winced. They hadn't done anything yet. So in a way, they weren't really even married, because Stella was afraid. She might as well face it, she was afraid. She couldn't deal with it. The second after she arrived, she already knew she wanted to go back to New York and her father and the bakery. She was a coward, and she hated it. But she couldn't seem to force herself. Had there really not been any other options for her and her father? Had becoming a mail-order bride and marrying this businessman been a good idea? As the days ticked off, she lost more and more of her hope. She also couldn't deal with the thought of being tied to this man, a stranger, and giving him children. Of course, he wanted them. He had married her for this, he wanted legitimate heirs now, and he wasn't so young anymore. But Stella couldn't bear it, and she blamed herself harshly for it. "That's what you get for marrying for survival," she chided herself. "I know. I'm sorry, but I'm not feeling well," she said, guilt surging through her. "I will get better soon. Just please wait, Sherman. I'm so sorry for all this. It's awful for me as well. What woman doesn't want to have a proper marriage? Leave the tea outside, Sherman. It'll be all right." "Fine," Sherman said gruffly through the door. "I will give you a few more days, woman, but only that. Whatever you have, the cold or whatever it is, better be gone by then. And if it's not, I'm sure a few minutes with you won't make me too sick. I'm a strong man." Stella mumbled something to him, not really paying attention to what she was saying. It was all lies and empty platitudes. What sort of wife had she become? Her mother would be disappointed, but then her mother would probably say she had it coming, selling herself like that. She listened to her husband's heavy steps thunder through the corridor as he walked away from the room she had sequestered herself in. She brought her feet up to the bed and hugged her arms around her bony knees. She had known some other girls back in New York who had gone off west as mail-order brides, and whenever one of them visited or a parent received a letter, they all seemed very happy. That was why Stella hadn't been afraid to do the same, but she envied them, now. She envied those who had done this and found love when she had only found loneliness and fear. It seemed she was one of the unlucky ones. Though she did marry a businessman instead of a rancher, maybe she would have been happier if she had married the latter. She could be out tending to horses or chickens or working steadily, instead of cooped up in here, the wife of a man who wouldn't give her anything to do at all with her days except bear his children. But her father's bakery had been suffering. He was suffering. Though now Stella could think what she liked, a few months ago they really had no other option than this. In the missives she and Sherman had exchanged, They both had made it very clear that she would marry him in exchange for his help in financing her father's business. And she needed to do her part. It was only fair, it was only right. But Sherman was not the man she had thought he would be. He was so much older, and there was something about him that scared her. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but it was there. Or maybe she was imagining it, giving herself an excuse for her own behavior. "You were foolish," she told herself for the 100th time. "He's a rich businessman, so of course, he's older than what he claimed in the letter. Of course, he lied. I bet everyone lies on those things. Maybe that's the truth, everyone going around lying to everybody else, and I was the fool who told the truth. But now, I must bear it, because I'm married already. There's no running back from this." She stood up. "No," she argued with herself. "You won't put yourself down for being truthful, Stella. You're a good woman." And Sherman had lied to her. Facts were facts. Still, what could she do? There was no way for her to leave this situation. She was already married, and her father needed this. Sheriff James Madsen was an honest man, a hard-working man, but most of all, he was a worried man. He didn't worry because he was incompetent, no, he actually was a very good sheriff, and the people trusted him to bring criminals to justice. Besides that, his investigations on the illegal dealings of Sherman Marlow, a local businessman, were bearing fruit. It was one of the most important investigations he was conducting these days. Sherman was a powerful local man, and the sheriff had been after him for years now. Sheriff Madsen stroked his beard and squinted to take a better look at the papers in his hand. He palmed his gun, but it was not like Marlow was in the room with him. Nevertheless, the sheriff felt frustrated and with nowhere to turn. But did he wish he had something to shoot at right now? The letter in his hand was short and simple. It was penned by one of his best men, and it explained that though technically they knew all the dirt they could get on Marlow, the man was too smart, and none of it was concrete enough to bring him to justice. Yet, it was insufferable, and it had been the same for years now. How many men had Marlow cheated by now? How many businesses had been taken over by him? Too many, way too many. The sheriff was quickly losing his patience. He had to get this man somehow, before the man got to him or any of his other townsfolk, of course. He was a competent man. Being competent made his job all the more dangerous, especially when some of his men had already spotted some of Marlow's men lingering around places they had no business lingering around. The sheriff knew it was a matter of time before this situation exploded, and yet, there was not much that he could do until it did. His job was dangerous, he knew that. "Maybe," he muttered, his eyes narrowing, "I can make it so everybody knows just who killed me if I happen to turn up dead." It was a grim thought, but a man didn't become a sheriff in the West by shying away from this kind of thing. He pulled a piece of paper toward himself and started to write. Sheriff Lucas Simon back in Pine Ridge, Colorado, was an old friend and a confidant. He didn't know much about the situation with Marlow, but they had talked about it once or twice the last time they'd seen each other. He would know enough, surely, to trust Madsen when he spoke. He wrote down everything he could, sparing no detail, because in this kind of situation, one wrong word or assumption could put it all up in flames. Whatever happened, his efforts to bring down Sherman wouldn't be in vain. He would make sure the man got what he deserved. He was the sheriff, after all, this was his job, and for years he had done it well. Chapter 2. Sherman Marlow was downright sick of the sheriff's meddling. He sat at his desk and thought long and hard about what he was going to do about the pesky situation. Of course, it was risky to murder the sheriff, but the man had gotten too close, way too close. And Sherman was just arrogant enough to believe he could get away with it. After all, who would go against him? Without the sheriff, the others would lose any courage they had mustered to confront him, and the general townsfolk wouldn't know anything besides. He smiled to himself. He didn't need to do anything complicated after all. It could be very simple. He could just shoot the man. Well, of course, he wouldn't do it. One of his men would. Sherman would never dirty his own hands like that. Stella was not the sort of woman who would ever feel comfortable in a saloon. She tried not to judge the girls who worked around here, but she thought she would never set foot inside this kind of place. She didn't like drinking, and Sherman smoked a kind of cigarette that smelled foul. But now, there she was, pressed against Sherman's side as he drank glass after glass of whiskey and smoked those foul cigarettes, the stale smell of them permeating the entire saloon. Stella felt as if she'd never be able to smell anything else. He was neck-deep in a poker game. She looked away, trying to pretend she was literally anywhere else. But he kept her by his side, and it made her want to choke or to push him away. She was desperate for some air and some distance. Why in the world did he insist on bringing her? She understood men sometimes had to come out and do this sort of thing, but she never imagined she would end up with a husband who would force her to accompany him, as if she were any other saloon girl instead of his wife. She flinched as the men around her let out a bout of loud, drunken laughter. I don't belong here, she thought morosely. She hunched her shoulders and smiled awkwardly at her husband. She braced herself to talk to him. She was not staying here a second longer, even if it meant having to speak up. Sherman, I will just. You're cheatin', Sherman screamed over her, clearly not having realized his own wife had been speaking to him. Give me back my coins, you scumbag. I saw you with that card up your sleeve. If Sherman didn't notice Stella, it just made it all the easier for her to slip out. And he only barely noticed indeed, as he glanced at her as she stood up from their table and walked away. He frowned but didn't stop her, maybe too drunk to realize she was leaving. What would her father think if he saw her now? Oh, how he would hate it. He had only ever wanted the best for her, had refused so many men who had come by and asked for her hand because he wanted his daughter to marry someone perfect. It was a sort of comfort to know her poor father wouldn't have wanted her to be here, even if it meant his bakery would have to close. Truth be told, Stella knew her father was not so passionate about the bakery anymore. Ever since her mother died, he'd lost his love for most things. But it was all they had left of the dear woman, and Stella hadn't wanted to see it gone. Perhaps in some ways, it had been a selfish thing. She had left her father alone, after all. She sighed, wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders. It was dark outside, and the streets were mostly empty. She didn't feel that safe, but neither had she felt safe inside the saloon. It was no place for a lady. Maybe, she thought with a sardonic smile, if something happens to me now, Sherman will realize his mistake in bringing me to this saloon and never do it again. But of course, she didn't actually think anything would happen. It was a terrible coincidence that she had stepped out right then, that she happened to look to the side, that she happened to be one of the few people who would recognize the man as one of her husband's ruffians. The sheriff's office was near the saloon and a blur of movement caught her eye. She turned and peered about curiously. Was the sheriff only leaving his office now? He really was a dedicated man, she thought. He served them all well, but there should be a limit to everything. Didn't he have a woman to get home to? She would rather have married someone like the sheriff, even if it meant she might become a widow sooner than expected. The man approached the sheriff. He was wearing a hat low over his face and nondescript clothes, but Stella recognized the ghastly scar on his hand, even at that distance. It was distinctively in the shape of a jagged star, and she knew this was Clive, her husband's right-hand man. Clive was an unpleasant sort of man, but he never did anything with her, for fear of her husband's vengeance, she was sure. It was the one thing she was grateful to Sherman for. Even if it was Sherman's fault that Clive lingered around in the first place. Horror filled her when he drew out a gun and shot the sheriff at point-blank range. The bullet pierced him so thoroughly, so deeply, so quickly, that the sheriff didn't even scream. He simply dropped dead. The sound of the shot was only barely heard over the raucous laughter coming from the saloon, and Stella knew, then and there, that the only one who would ever know what happened there was her. She trembled and caught her breath. She knew what Clive would do when he realized she was now a witness to a crime she had no doubt that Sherman had orchestrated. For Clive never did anything unless her husband ordered it. She was in grave danger. She turned around and ran, her blood cold with terror. Chapter 3. Stella managed to curl up beside some crates outside a shop and sleep fitfully for a few hours. After being upset about it earlier in the evening, she was now glad that Sherman had stayed on at the saloon with her until so late at night. It meant that Stella only had to hide and wait for a few hours until she could catch the next train out of Texas. She crouched for hours there, stiff and terrified, trembling with the cold, trying to count her coins as she heard Sherman's men grousing around looking for her. She prayed fervently, and it seemed God was on her side. She went to the station and caught the train, sure that none of them had caught sight of her. She had more coins than she'd thought. She realized with a sort of hysterical humor that Sherman had been pilfering coins into her bag during his game of poker. She had been able to leave him only because he had been cheating, and it made her feel better. God really did punish people when they deserved it, even if it seemed like a ridiculous and ironic thing. But it just might save her life. The trip was tolerable. It was certainly shorter than the one she had taken from New York to marry Sherman, which had been as tiring as it had been unbearable. She spent the present trip dozing and putting her head in her hands, allowing herself to feel desperate in small, carefully balanced amounts. It wouldn't do for her to break down now. People would wonder, and perhaps news of her presence would trickle back to her husband. She had no doubt that Sherman had already figured out why she had left. She'd only had a few hours to decide what she was going to do, how she was going to run. Lord, what a fool she had been. How would this affect her father? Would Sherman go after him? Was her father in danger? She should have stayed with her father from the start. She needed to make her way back to him, back to New York. But wouldn't that be the first place Sherman would search for her? Getting off the train in Pine Ridge, Colorado, was a decision she made on the fly, when the train stopped. She didn't want to spend any more time on a train than she absolutely had to, and something told her this was a decent place to linger. This is good, she thought, looking around the unfamiliar station, trying not to notice the loving homecomings around her. I'm being unpredictable, that is good. I will stay here for a while, then think of a proper plan to get back to my father. A part of her knew that going back to her father was the most predictable thing she could do, that she would be putting both herself and him in danger, but she wouldn't be able to stay away from him for long. She knew her father would be glad to have her back anyway, even if she brought trouble along with her. She gripped her small bag tightly and walked about, peering around to locate the hotel in town. She had carefully counted her coins. The coins Sherman had shoved in there carelessly now meant her future. She still had enough for a night at a hotel, she thought, though she would be lost after that. She found herself wishing that Sherman had stolen more, then felt guilty at the thought. Stealing was wrong, even if it was helping her right now. Maybe she would think of a way to give it all back someday. She needed to find some temporary work. Her deepest wish as she walked through the unknown town, alone and scared and hungry, was to go to the hotel and fall asleep, and leave her worries for tomorrow, to get some rest, however restless, but she couldn't. She had to fix this now, as much as she could. She needed to find a job so she could save money to go back to New York to her father. If she stopped now, she felt like she would never get up again. She would drown under the despair of her bad choices. And so, she walked around, her body stiff and her arms hugging herself. During her meandering, she happened to glance at a mercantile store and caught sight of something attached to its window. She didn't know why it caught her attention. Many of the stores had papers glued to their windows or tacked up on their walls, but something about this one small piece of paper made her stop. She moved closer, and her eyes scanned the paper. It was an advert. An advert from an old woman who lived alone, asking for a live-in helper. It was so exactly what Stella needed, and she felt so overwhelmingly grateful and exhausted, that she sat down and cried. God had put this in her path, she knew. Finally, her fear left her, and for a short moment, she knew everything was going to be all right. She asked for directions from the store clerk, then headed out to the Wilson cabin on a homestead a half-mile outside town. The house was small compared to Sherman's, but then any house would look small when compared to Sherman's. That fact alone made her instantly fond of it. She suddenly thought it was the most beautiful home in the world. She approached it slowly, looking around as if someone, Clive or another of Sherman's men, was about to jump at her from a bush. She knocked on the door hesitantly, so lightly that almost no sound was made. She gathered her wits and her courage and knocked again. After some time, a tall, brooding man answered the door. Stella immediately took a terrified step back. It was not that the man was scary, but he was tall and she had just left such a horrible situation. The thought that Stella could have been lured by another awful, lying man to this secluded home was so terrifying that for a moment her breath stopped in her chest. Was she that much of a fool? Yes, he asked, frowning down at her with confusion plain on his face. Stella swallowed and mustered up all of her courage, again. "Is there a Hilda Wilson who lives here?" she asked, managing to rein in the stutter. "I would like to talk to her, but I thought no one else lived with her." Who are you? The stammer came out again, evidence of how nervous she was. The man's frown deepened. He looked her up and down, assessing, as if taking stock of her obvious lack of sleep, the rumpled state of her clothes, and the one fact that Stella had been trying not to think about. It had to be obvious from her face and her eyes that she had been crying. He looked at her hands, clutching at her shawl with white knuckles, as if utterly unable to understand what he was supposed to do with her. Despite everything, she couldn't help but notice his intriguing blue eyes and his wild dark brown hair. He had a square, masculine face, utterly handsome. She thought a bit hysterically that maybe she wouldn't have minded it as much if Sherman had looked like this. "Why do you want to know?" he eventually asked. Stella opened her mouth to answer when a soft voice sounded out from within the house. "Mason? Who's at the door?" A woman appeared behind him, unceremoniously nudging the man aside with her hip, casually and easily. Stella blinked at her. This is the man's mother, she realized suddenly. There was no one else she could be, for all that Stella couldn't see a single similarity between them. She couldn't think of any other relationship that would make her look up at the man so fondly. "Hello. I am Hilda. Were you looking for me, girl?" Hilda Wilson. It was not a trick, the man hadn't lured her there. Stella's relief made her shoulders drop, and she almost sat down on the ground again. "About the advert," she said, the last of her anxiousness making her words curt. "Oh, yes," the woman exclaimed, glancing a bit nervously at the man. "Well, come in. Did you bring your things?" "Bring?" "No," Stella said, realizing how foolish she must look. "I just came to ask." "Well, you're hired, so bring your things as soon as possible." "What's your name, girl?" Stella gaped at her. She decided she wouldn't look the gift horse in the mouth, and she had enough presence of mind to know she couldn't give the woman her real name. "Ma, what are you doing?" the man asked, exasperated. "Hirin' her. Come in. I think I still have some bread left from breakfast. You look like you need something to eat. What did you say your name was?" "Lisa," Stella blurted out. Lisa Fulton." "Thank you, ma'am. I'd love some bread." "There you go," Hilda said, pleased, when Stella walked in. She led her to the kitchen, Mason lingering curiously behind them. "Sit down, I will get you some food." "I'm so glad you're here. I've been waiting for some time now." "Mason, stop pouting. I will tell you what I'm doing later, after our guest's been fed." "Fine," Mason said with a sigh. "Lisa, this is my son Mason," Hilda said affably, giving the man a warm smile. He nodded at her. Stella gave him an awkward smile. She felt a bit guilty now for having thought badly of him, but she couldn't be faulted. He had that look on his face, the look of someone only barely home, like he was about to step out and run to the woods at the first excuse. He stared at her like he'd forgotten what manners were, assessing her curiously and without shame. Her eyes dropped. At least, she was safe for now. Chapter 4. "Boss," Clive said nervously, unable to hide it. "We still haven't found her." Sherman snarled at him, and a flick of his arm sent the entire contents of what had been on his desk sprawling to the floor. Clive and the others winced at the sound of shattering glass. Sherman didn't care. He would have drawn his gun on them if only it were at his hip instead of hanging on the wall. "I'm tired of your sloppy work," he growled. "You can't find one woman. What am I paying you for?" "We'll find, Clive swore, straightening his spine. "She can't have gone far." "I know," Sherman shouted. "Which is why you should have found the woman already. She's a witness now, the one person who knows I'm behind the killing of that fool Madsen. But it's obvious you lot won't do anything, so now I have to fix this on my own." "Mr. Marlow," one of his henchmen started. "Leave," Sherman growled, and they all scurried away. He sat back down, stroking his chin and trying to think of an idea. If brute force wasn't going to work, maybe being clever would. "Clive," he shouted. The man quickly walked back in. "I have an idea," Sherman said slowly. "If you lot can't find her, why don't we get some help?" "Help?" Clive asked, confused. Sherman smiled. It was a slimy, uncomfortable, ugly smile. "Let the law find her," he said. "Let them go after her. We'll say she murdered dear old Sheriff Madsen, call Rudson, ask him to make wanted posters for her, distribute them around town with a bounty of $100. Ha! Those bounty hunters around will find her in no time if the law doesn't." "Ma?" Mason said reproachfully. "Yes?" Hilda kept on folding the clothes and didn't turn to look at him. There was a pause. "You said you were going to explain what was happening," he said. "That was good and all, but then a stranger moved in, and it's been 2 days now. So? What's going on? What did you mean when you said you hired her?" Hilda made a grimace. "Mason, Lisa is going to stay with us from now on, that's what. I had put in an advert for a companion a week before you arrived, you see. Henry is dead, and I was all alone, and now Lisa is here." Hilda could almost hear his frown deepening, even though she still was not looking at him. There was silence. Hilda imagined her son opening his mouth, then closing it again, not letting his thoughts out, that Lisa wasn't needed anymore now he was home. Because neither of them knew how long he would stay, did they? He could promise all he wanted, but she'd seen him looking longingly out the window already. He was a restless spirit, and unfortunately, they both knew he would leave her again. So, Lisa had to stay. "She's a stranger," Mason said at last. "We don't know anything about her." "It's not safe, Ma. Couldn't you have hired someone from town?" No one from town answered, and Lisa is a lovely girl, Hilda chastised him. "I think we'll all get on very well, all of us. She's harmless, besides." "Mason, did you look at her? She didn't have a single bag on her. The poor thing, she was so hungry. You don't find that suspicious?" Mason tried again, coming to stand in front of her. He crossed his arms. "Why don't you ask her why she's got nothing?" "Oh, Mason, all women have their secrets. I wouldn't do that to her." He sighed, evidently giving up, at least, for now. Hilda beamed up at him, quite pleased with herself. Stella washed the dishes while Hilda worked on the baking. Stella watched her, utterly distracted from her duties. She had grown up in a bakery and knew that Hilda had a talent for this. It was familiar and nostalgic in a way that tore at her heart. Her father had never baked like this, like it was a joy. It had been a duty to help his wife, and then a reminder that she was gone. It endeared Stella to Hilda so quickly that a week after she had arrived, it already felt as if she had been there for months. Stella hummed as she worked. She was not completely comfortable yet, but it was a pleasant afternoon. She looked out the window where she stood and watched as Mason patted the horses, entertaining them for a moment before bringing them back to the stables. He hadn't really spoken to Stella much after that first day. He was not often inside the house, and he just sent her strange, searching looks when they were in the same room. Her time with Sherman had taught her how to spot a bad man, and after the little Stella had seen of Mason, she could tell his gaze was not malicious. It made her curious and safe enough to ask about it. Hilda, Stella started, hesitating a bit before she continued. About Mason. Hilda's eyes narrowed. He hasn't been giving you any trouble, has he? No, no. Stella was quick to reassure her. I haven't seen much of him for there to be any trouble. Hilda looked out the window, following the path Stella's gaze had taken, and saw her son with the horses. She sighed. He's grown to be a strange man, she said, and yet she didn't seem bothered by her words, just utterly fond of him. He was always a strange boy, but who could blame him? Haven't seen what he had to see. No child deserves to see their parents dead like that. Stella blinked at her, puzzled. But you're... Oh, I took him in, Hilda said. Me and my Henry. Henry had always wanted a son, you know, and I couldn't give him that. Sad as it was for the boy, we were so happy to have him. He was 13 when his parents was killed by outlaws. No one was surprised when Mason became a bounty hunter. It was his destiny. But dearest Lord, girl, I wish it didn't mean he was so far from home all the time. But he's here now, Stella said softly, turning to look at the man again. She caught him as he left, his figure disappearing. Suddenly, she felt like she understood Mason, at least better than before. Maybe she hadn't lost her mother in the same violent way he had lost his folks, but she knew what it was all the same. Yes, Hilda said sadly. He's here, until he leaves again. Chapter 5. Dinner was not awkward thanks to Lisa and his ma, because if it were left to him, it definitely would have been. It had been about 2 weeks since Lisa had arrived, and Mason still felt strange around her. He was a bounty hunter, after all, had been for 10 years, and it had honed his instincts like nothing else in this world could. Lisa made him want to narrow his eyes and question her, but at the same time, she didn't seem dangerous. He knew she had a secret, but he also sensed she was a good person. She and his mother had grown close in the short time since she'd come. You, a voice rang out, cutting him out of his thoughts, have been far too quiet, boy. What is it you're thinking about? Mason blinked at his mother. He said belatedly. Nothing. Didn't mean to ignore you, Ma. Were you talking to me? Not really, the woman said, still miffed. I was speaking generally, and of course dear Lisa answered, but you were just staring into space like you were seeing a ghost or something. No ghost, Mason said with a shake of his head, an amused smile appearing at his lips despite himself. With all my days on the road, I still haven't found one of those, Ma. What was it you were saying generally? Hilda turned to beam at Lisa, who looked down, embarrassed. A blush rose on her face, and when she glanced up at Mason, he noticed that the pink tinge to her cheeks made her green eyes look even more vibrant. He looked away, too. Lisa's made strudel for dessert, his mom said, utterly delighted. You know I haven't done it in so long. Me and Henry didn't like it nearly as much as you did, but she says she learned it. Where did you learn it, girl? Lisa grimaced. My mother had she used to make them. Your mother had what? Mason asked. She used to make them, Lisa said, her shoulders hunching. It was guilt Mason recognized in her shoulders, guilt when she glanced at Hilda with that fond look. He didn't know what to do with it. I will check on it, Lisa said quietly and stood up. Hilda and Mason traded a look. The dear doesn't seem that comfortable around us, his mother said sadly. She's comfortable with you, Mason countered, shaking his head. It's me, but, well, I think any woman would be uncomfortable in a strange man's house. I think she's been getting along with you all right these past weeks, Ma. She has, his ma said, a bit happier. She's a good woman, Mason. And you didn't hear it from me, but she baked strudel because I happened to mention a couple of days ago that you like it. Lisa came back before he could answer, which was just as well, because he didn't know what to say. He was not able to sort out his thoughts before the aroma of strudel hit him. It brought him back to a memory he had long forgotten, one of the first days he had been here at the Wilsons' place, less than a month after his parents were killed. He wouldn't eat, until Hilda made strudel and brought the whole thing to him and sat down beside him on the bed. That was the moment it had hit him, small and scared and angry as he had been, that Hilda really did want what was best for him. That she would never be his mother, would never replace her, but she could be his ma all the same. "Oh," he said a bit dumbly, looking on as Lisa put the thing on the table between them all and started dishing it out for them. He looked up at her when she set a slice on his plate with a shy, hesitant smile. "I hope I'm not oversteppin'," she said a bit quietly. "But your mother said you liked it and hadn't had it in so long, so I thought to make it for you." Mason couldn't help the responding smile that rose to his face, warm and pleased. The smell of the freshly baked strudel and the sweetness of his memories and the beauty of the woman in front of him made it impossible for him not to warm up to her. "It's all right," he said. "Thank you. I haven't had it since the last time I visited, some 2 or 3 years ago, right, Ma?" "That's right." "I'm glad it's fine, then," Lisa said, then looked away. Mason took a bite of his dessert and allowed himself to look at her for just one more moment, his eyes lingering on the strand of light brown hair that was curling by her ear. Stella was about to start on the dishes when she heard steps behind her and tensed. She knew Hilda's steps by now, the slow shuffling way she walked that spoke of her bad knees and how much worse they were getting, but these footsteps were too firm for that. She'd thought she had done well with Mason today, but she needed some time to recover before talking to him again. But he didn't know that, of course, and approached her easily. She kept on with the dishes and didn't turn to him. "I can do those," he said. She turned to look at him, baffled. "What? You do the dishes?" "No. You have work around the ranch, don't you?" "I will do part of them, then," he said, raising one eyebrow. "I think you deserve some rest after making lunch and all." I'm just trying to thank you for the strudel." Stella felt herself soften. She was touched by his offer, however much it surprised her. In all her years, she'd never seen her father help with the dishes. "Nothin' to thank," she said, smiling up at him. "Give me that dish towel," he said. "Sit down on the stool and rest for a while, Lisa." The mention of her false name jarred Stella back to real life. The smile slipped from her face. How could she stand here and share a smile with this man while lying to him? At least Hilda wasn't there. Stella was finding it harder and harder to lie to the woman every day. She liked Hilda too much to think about it. Mason gazed somberly down at her. Stella tried to give him a smile and stepped away from the sink so he could do as he'd asked. She waited, breath held, for him to ask her what was wrong. But he didn't. Mason's expression softened, like he knew something was going on but figured it wasn't his business. Stella felt so relieved by his silence and so thankful for it that her eyes burned. She watched him for a moment, as he gazed out the window above the sink as if he already missed being outside. A restless spirit, Hilda called him sometimes, and it was obvious there that he was out of his element inside the kitchen. Stella cleared her throat. "If you tell me something else you like," she said, "I'll make it for you. I know how to bake many things. My mother, she used to have a bakery. Well, it's my father's, now, but she was the one who loved it." "I don't know much about desserts," Mason admitted, glancing at her, a bit embarrassed. "We didn't have much opportunity to eat sweets on the road, and I always preferred to spend my money on other things. But if you make anything Ma makes, I will be happy." "I will ask her, then," Stella said softly. Mason grinned. "Lisa, dear, I'm going into town," Hilda called, patting Stella's arm. Stella was busy stirring a sauce for lunch and only glanced at her. "There's an event at the church, the one I told you about. Are you sure you don't want to come? Meet the neighbors?" "Better not, Hilda," Stella said a bit awkwardly. "There's so much work to do." "You could spare one day," Hilda tried again, putting her hands on her hips. "I hired you to be my companion, not my maid, after all. And it'd be good for you to meet the townsfolk. I won't be having another hermit under my roof, girl. Mason's enough." "I'll go some other day," Stella said, looking away, her heart squeezed by guilt. But of all the things she was relaxing about, out of everything she could allow herself to say or do for Hilda and Mason, going to town was not one of them. It was dangerous to her. She realized how far-fetched it was, but she had a recurring fear that someone would recognize her. "It'll be good for you," Hilda said, and added after a pause, "There are some good men around town, you know. A young woman like you ought to find someone soon." Stella stilled. When she looked at Hilda, Hilda had a pointed, searching look on her face. Stella didn't know what to say. They were both thinking the same thing. There was Mason. Mason, with his hazel eyes and his messy brown hair, his easy hands and warming presence. Mason, who took care of his mother and who would take good care of her, who would probably be the kind of husband Stella had been hoping for when she signed up to come marry someone out west. Mason, who had shown himself to be kind. I can't," Stella said, too honest when she should have told a good lie. Hilda didn't press it, she clasped Stella's shoulder and left. "You're still a married woman," Stella told herself, shaking her head. And the fact of the matter was she was in Pine Ridge temporarily. She shouldn't forget that. She shouldn't let herself forget that, no matter how much she wanted to. Chapter 6. Mason couldn't pay attention to the sermon. He felt bad, guilt and nerves making him jittery, but it wasn't like he'd ever needed a church to pray to God during his 10 years as a bounty hunter. His mother beside him paid enough attention for about 3 people, anyway. Mason sat beside her with his hat in his hands and couldn't stop staring at a woman 2 rows in front of him, to the side. He was transfixed. Not by her beauty or by the babe she had on her lap, pink-cheeked and blonde and well-behaved. No, he was transfixed by how much she looked like Lisa and by the picture that she and her child painted. She had Lisa's brown hair, though longer than Lisa's, and from this far, Mason couldn't see if her eyes were green or not, but he thought they were. He couldn't stop looking at her and seeing Lisa as a mother, Lisa with a baby in her arms, Lisa cooing to the child softly, Lisa so gentle and beautiful. "Stop staring," Hilda hissed to him in a whisper. "Pay attention. You're not 15 anymore, boy." "Sorry," Mason muttered. He still couldn't stop looking, couldn't stop thinking about Lisa as a wife and mother. As his wife, as the mother of his children. Mason really was not 15 anymore, and these past months with his mom made him think about having a family of his own more times than he cared to count. He couldn't deny the attraction he felt for Lisa. And yet, could he be with her? He had been a bounty hunter for years, and what woman would love a man who left his home all the time? She had been a city girl, he knew, for all that she'd never said anything, she had an accent. Would a city girl want to stay on a ranch with him, especially if he was taking off all the time? Would she even think of staying at Pine Ridge? He spent the next hour thinking thoughts that circled around without going anywhere, and when the service ended, he was as frustrated as he as annoyed with himself. "You've been cooped up in here too long," he told himself. "Ma," he said as soon as they stepped out of the church, before she could catch sight of a friend and start chatting. "I'm thinking of spending a few days away from home. I got a letter some time ago. John told me he and some others would pass not far from here in a couple of days." "Oh," his mother said, drooping with disappointment. "You mean you'll leave, or?" "Just for a few days," Mason said, a bit offended. "John is another bounty hunter. And I wouldn't leave you like that, out of nowhere." "Oh, that's good then. I'll ride out tonight," Mason said resolutely. "So I can meet him when he passes by. I wouldn't stay out more than 15 days or so." "That's all right," his mother said gently. "Though I don't know what I will tell Lisa. I know she was planning to bake something for you tomorrow." Mason winced. "Once I'm back, I will eat anything she makes." He was planning to come back, but then, not everything always went as planned. Mason headed out, too much of a coward to give Lisa a proper goodbye. He wondered why he'd felt it necessary to leave in the first place. Was it to avoid becoming too attached to her? Because right then, he didn't want to leave at all. He hoped she would forgive him if he brought her a gift back. He shot out on his horse, and as soon as he was on the open plain with the wind in his hair, it felt like all his body relaxed at once. He was where he belonged, where he was most himself, out on the range. He met John and Dale by a stretch of nameless road, smiling when he caught sight of them, and smiling wider when he realized Mantadapa was with them. The Indian smiled back, lifting a hand in greeting. Mason quickly rode to their side and all of them dismounted at once. He first grasped John, giving him a firm slap on the back, then he shook Dale's hand. Mantadapa gripped his arm, squeezing his shoulder. "It's been too long," Mason said with a grin. "Sure has," John agreed, adjusting the huge mustache above his lips. A mustache that hadn't been there the last time Mason had seen him. "Not since we caught that man. What was his name?" "That fellow with the farm and the wife everyone hated, the one who had murdered about 5 people before we stopped him." "Good times," Dale said with a roll of his eyes. "I hear you're retired now, Mason." "Tell me that's a lie." "I thought you needed some rest last time I saw you," Mantadapa said with a tilt of his head. "That was 2 years ago." "Too long ago," Mason said with a smile. "You wouldn't believe where I am now, back home goin' to church with Ma, got a girl at home, well, not my girl, but still." "Have you gotten married?" Dale exclaimed. "You didn't tell us." "Look at us, stealing her man, poor woman," John said with a solemn shake of his head. "Quit jokin', Dot." Mason snapped, punching John's shoulder. "I just said she's not mine. She's a companion for my ma, that's all." "But you mentioned her for a reason," Mantadapa said with a knowing look. "She's a pretty woman, is all," Mason told him, crossing his arms. "Yeah, well, there will be plenty of pretty women at the saloon." "Let's get goin'," John shouted, hopping back onto his horse. "Then, we'll discuss the latest bounty we're gonna collect." Dale quickly followed, the two of them always hot on the heels of one another. They were brothers and being around them was as interesting as it was infuriating. It made Mason glad he didn't have siblings. "Did you mention her for a reason?" Mantadapa asked him lightly as they watched the two brothers gallop away before them. "Maybe," Mason allowed. "I needed to clear my head. She's been with us for some time now, and I do like her. But I don't know if I'd be the best husband, and I know she's hidin' something, and you worry much." Mantadapa told him. "You need to be open to new things, my friend. If this woman's here, why not know her?" "I needed to clear my head." "I know what you're thinking," his friend told him. "I'm heading back home after we catch the outlaw." "Come back with me then." "Stay a few days." Mason looked at him, relieved. "I will be happy to go if you're invitin' me. I'd been hopin' to visit the Cheyenne for some time now. I just couldn't make the time." Mantadapa said, "Remember that you're not supposed to visit when you're running, Mason. Don't run from this woman. You can figure things out with her." "Maybe if you came back and met her," Mason said wistfully. "Maybe at your wedding," Mantadapa said with a laugh. "Lisa, girl," Hilda said in a low, worried voice, "why don't you draw away the curtains, at least? You're keepin' the living room so dark. You haven't let me open them in days." Stella gave her a pained smile. "Maybe tomorrow?" she asked, shoulders hunching in. My eyes are huttin', that's all." "All right, then," Hilda said, hesitant. Truth was, there was no reason for Stella to feel so vulnerable without Mason in the house. But some part of her just couldn't bear it. Ever since he had left, she hadn't had the courage to even open the curtains, much less step out to the porch. She knew it worried Hilda, but there was nothing she could do. Mason was not due to come back for over a week still, if he did indeed stay away for the 15 days he'd mentioned to Hilda. The thought was unbearable. Stella would have to step out eventually, terrified or not. "Are you sure you're quite all right?" Hilda asked her quietly, sitting beside her on the couch. "I'm afraid," Stella admitted, too fond of Hilda to continue lying. "But I don't really have any reason to be." I'd rather keep the curtains closed till Mason comes back, but I know that's too much. What is it, girl? Hilda asked, squeezing her hand. We're not fools, you know. We know there's something you're covering up. If you'd just tell us. Stella dislodged her hand and stood up, her gaze skittering away. There's nothing, she lied. It's nothing. Thank you for indulging me, Hilda, but I best get back to work. She fled to the kitchen too quickly for Hilda to follow on her bad knees. Stella leaned against the sink and took deep breaths. She hadn't seen anything. No one was after her. It was just nerves. She had no reason to be more worried now than she had been before. But she knew Sherman's men were after her. Deep in her gut, she knew. It was all just a matter of time. Chapter 7. Despite his plans, Mason returned after only a few days, and the change in Lisa was almost palpable. Something must have happened while he was gone, but his mother assured him otherwise. For her part, Hilda was torn between feeling terribly sorry for the girl and feeling joyous at how safe her son made Lisa feel. They opened all the windows and the doors and Lisa made strudel again, and dinner that day was a comfortable, joyful occasion. Mason, boy, she said the next day, before Mason could step out to do his neglected chores. Why don't you go to town to buy supplies today? We've been needin' some things since you left. He frowned. You should have told me before, Ma. Well, I'm telling you now, she said with a huff. She eyed Lisa as she entered the living room and said loudly, why don't you take Lisa with you? She'd do well to visit town for once. Lisa froze, turning to stare at her with wide eyes. Mason gazed at Lisa, taking in her obvious fear and surprise. I don't think she wants to go, he said. Nonsense, Hilda said. She ignored the confused, imploring look Lisa sent her. She'll be perfectly safe with you there. Lisa lifted her arms to hug herself, but something about her stance softened slightly. She stole a look at Mason when the man turned to look at Hilda. I'd rather not go, Lisa tried. Hilda was old, but she was neither blind nor a fool. She widened her eyes innocently. Girl, you've been cooped up here for too long. You haven't left once. It's such a beautiful sunny day. Don't you want to go with Mason and see the town, buy some things? Surely nothing will happen with him near. Lisa relaxed some, though her expression said she knew exactly what Hilda was doing. Hilda gave her a wink. Do you think something will happen? Mason asked. Not really, Lisa said, and really, Hilda thought, the girl was a terrible liar. We can go. I am tired of being cooped up. I'm sure it'll be all fine. All right, Mason said, the expression of his face one of someone who would make sure everything did indeed turn out all right. Hilda smiled, victorious. They rode together into town. It really was a quaint place, and so different from what Stella was used to back at home in New York. She followed as Mason walked unhurriedly around. Hilda hadn't specified which supplies she needed, and Mason seemed okay with just walking around for a while. I've been thinkin', he said suddenly, glancing at her then away as if afraid that she'd run if he set his eyes on her for too long. You've got an odd way of speakin'. Where are you from, really? Stella was too warm from the sun and his proximity to ignore the question. She sent him a look. He knew she was a private person, but right then and there, she was feeling quite secure, and she answered him honestly. New York City, she said. Far from here, I know. Oh, so that's what New York sounds like, he said, and though she thought he would pry more, he didn't. He grew quiet, as if content to just walk with her. Stella would have preferred not to come, but at the end of the day, she was thankful she had. She had been feeling too cooped up without ever leaving the house, and she did want to get to know Mason better. And you? She asked. Oh, I'm from here, he told her, smiling as if happy she seemed interested enough to ask. I lived a bit further from town, but I'm sure Ma's told you how my parents were killed. Yes, she said, then bit her lip. I don't mean to be insensitive, Mason, but I'm curious." "It's all right," he said with a shrug. "After so long on the road with only men, I welcome your curiosity." "Hilda is not really your mother," she said. "But you still call her Ma." "But she is my mother," he denied, shaking his head, and yet he smiled at her, knowing what she meant. "For all that she did for me, that she does, same as Henry. How could I not call them my parents?" They walked in silence for a moment. "I don't think I'd be able to call anyone else Ma," she said in a small voice. "Even if Pa ever marries again." Mason's steps faltered in his surprise that she had shared something about her without him asking. "You lost your mother?" he asked. She shrugged, looked away. And for the rest of their afternoon, they walked together and spoke of nothing important, chatting about the people and what they were buying, walking just a bit closer to each other. Mason stepped out to the porch after dinner, happy to sit and smoke while he watched what could be seen of the ranch. His mother went to rest, tired after having done the dishes, and he assumed Lisa had done the same until she appeared beside him. "Do you mind?" she asked quietly. He shook his head, and she sat beside him on the bench. They were quiet for a moment. "Ma said you wouldn't even open the windows while I was gone," he murmured. "Two women alone have reason to be afraid," she countered. "But now you're here on the porch, because I'm here?" Lisa looked down at her lap. "Well," she said after a few moments. "You're a bounty hunter. I think there's nothing that can catch me here that you wouldn't be able to scare off. Right?" "Right," he agreed. A part of him felt very gratified that she trusted him like that, even if another part of him wanted to know what was up with this woman. They grew quiet. Mason stole glances at her as he smoked, admiring her beauty in the dark, lit up only by candle on the porch table. He couldn't deny what he felt for her. Lisa made him enjoy going around town, for all that he had never cared for it. She made him want to stay, if only because he knew she would be home waiting for him every evening. Maybe with her, he thought, he would finally find enough reason to tame his restlessness and stay home. Chapter 8. They stopped about a mile outside the little town in front of them. Pine Ridge, Sherman thought to himself disdainfully. Of all places for that woman to run to, she managed to not even leave the West. "We'll stay here for a while," he called out, and his men stopped around him. "You lot start setting up camp. It's too late for me to do anything today." Sherman dismounted his horse and met his right-hand man, who did the same. Clive was more confident than before. He had been the one to give Sherman the news they had found Stella, and he seemed confident that this had put him in Sherman's favor. "You go on," Sherman told him, nodding forward, to where the road went on. "Get to Pine Ridge and ask around for her. If you do find her, well, you know what to do." Clive nodded and smiled an ugly smile. Sherman watched as the man went on. They were pretty sure Stella was there. Clive had found out from a reliable source that a woman just like her had been spotted around town not too many days before. After what felt like so long, Sherman would be able to do away with the woman. She might have been his wife, but her being a witness to his man murdering Sheriff Madsen had much more weight. She was a loose end he didn't need with his whole fortune hanging in the balance, and it was not like she had wanted to give him heirs, anyway. Sherman stroked his beard and turned around to watch the men set up camp. Framing her for the murder was a good idea, he told himself with a smirk. "I'm actually surprised no bounty hunters found her and brought her to me yet. But we'll get her soon enough." Mason crept into the kitchen, looking around carefully. His mother caught sight of him, and her eyebrows pulled down, confused. "Ma," he whispered. "Is Lisa around?" "She's outside feed-in the horses, Mason," she said, baffled. "Are you creeping around like a toddler because you didn't want her to see you?" He straightened up with a smile. "Maybe." She shook her head fondly. "Sit down, boy. I have some toast from this morning, so let me feed you some. And tell me what it is you're here to tell me." Mason sat down, happy to have some time with his mother. He craned his neck but still couldn't look out the window above the sink properly. He thought that if he looked out, maybe he would have been able to see Lisa out there. Hilda set a plate with toast in the middle of the table and sat beside him. "Ma," he said, "I can't stop thinking about her." Hilda brightened up. "Is that so? You do mean Lisa, don't you?" "I do," he said, lowering his head and snatching some toast. "We've been talking more these days. I can't stop thinking about her, or thinking about how you said she felt safe with me around." "It's how a woman should feel around good men," Hilda said approvingly. Mason swallowed his toast and brushed crumbs from his trousers to the floor. "I'm plannin' on proposing to her," he revealed. Hilda gasped, a hand rising to her chest. She looked at him with a gleam in her eyes. "Mason," she exclaimed. "Really? You're plannin' on, oh, dear Lord." "I spoke to the sheriff last time I went to the town," he told her, squeezing her hand when she reached out to hold it. "Sheriff Simon said there's an old outstanding bounty for me to collect, and it should give me good money. I'm goin' to use it to buy a ring and then ask her." His mother started to cry, lifting a hand to half cover her mouth. "Oh, what a blessed day. You have all my blessings, Mason, and I just know she'll say yes." "I think so, too," he told her with a happy grin. Mason rode out to the sheriff's office a few hours later. He wouldn't let Lisa come with him, saying he was out on business, and was gratified by the disappointed expression on her face. She wanted to spend time with him, she liked him. He knew this would work out. Sheriff Simon greeted him easily. They had a good relationship from all the years Mason had spent as a bounty hunter around the area. They worked well together, and the sheriff trusted him. "So," Mason said, putting his hands in his pockets, "what have you got for me?" "I will get the papers, just wait a second," the sheriff said. When the man bent down to look in his desk for a file, Mason caught sight of the board behind him. It was filled with posters of wanted or missing people, and like always, Mason's eyes scanned it with interest. There was a missing child, a wanted bandit, and... He froze in horror. "Sheriff," he said, pointing at the poster. "Who's that?" "That woman, who is she?" Sheriff Simon straightened up, gave him an odd look, and turned around to see the poster. The woman drawn there was beautiful and slender. She had long hair and brilliant eyes. That was Lisa. That was his Lisa. Right there, wanted for a reward of $1,000. "Well, this poster came to us a few weeks ago." "That's Lisa," Mason said, full of horror. "That's the woman looking after my mother." He stood and stumbled from the office, heart in his throat. He didn't think about anything else but the fact that his mother was home alone with a wanted woman. Lord, this was why Lisa was so quiet about her past, so afraid and so private. She was an outlaw, hiding from the sheriff. Mason had been a fool. He felt a pang of fear for the days he spent off with his friends. Had his mother been in danger all along? God only knew what Lisa was planning. Sheriff Simon stood behind his desk with an open mouth and no idea what to do. His friend Mason had shot out like a bullet and didn't seem to even hear when Lucas called him back. These stupid young men who wouldn't sit and listen when their elders spoke to them. Now the sheriff would have another mess to take care of, he just knew. He turned around. The poster had been there for some time now. The sheriff had given it as much thought as he had any of the others. Lucas happened to look down and catch sight of a slip of paper that was peeking out from under the drawers beside his desk. He had a sudden odd feeling that this was important. He picked it up. It was a letter from his old friend Sheriff Madsen. Thinking about him, the sheriff swallowed down a pang of grief. He looked at the date and stared. It had been sent about a day before Madsen was killed. Lord, he said to himself, how could I have missed this? It must have flown under the furniture with the wind and stayed there, what bad luck. How things might have gone differently if he had seen this before, if he had known. At least now he was reading it. It spoke of that businessman Sherman whom Madsen had been running after for ages now, and how James didn't have enough evidence to convict the weasel, only to put his own life in danger at the man's hands. This woman young Lucas had run after was connected to Sherman Marlow. This woman had been in the Wilson cabin all along. He realized suddenly, blood running cold in his veins, would know what happened to his friend, would have the answers he had been looking for. And here, she had been living close to him all along. He had never seen the woman around, never caught sight of her, but Mrs. Wilson walked around town and went to church enough that people around town knew the young woman existed, at least. And hadn't there been some gossip about the Wilson boy walking around with a woman a few days before? But if she was in hiding from me, he thought, why would she give up on her hidin' to go walkin' around with Lucas? Unless, of course, she wasn't hiding from him. He looked back at the poster. The woman's name was Stella Marlow. She was Sherman Marlow's wife. There was a big chance she was involved in all this, right along with him. But there was also a chance she was running away from him, too. Lucas swore and picked up his hat, shoving the letter inside his coat as he marched out of the room. Chapter 9. Clive walked around Pine Ridge with his hat low over his eyes, mostly hiding his face. People hesitated to speak to him. He had a certain air around him that meant trouble, and not the amusing kind. Trouble of the sort when people's eyes were drawn to the pistol at his hips and then hurried away. Still, he managed to convince some people to chat with him over some whiskey at the saloon. People liked nothing more than free booze and gossip. Clive pretended he was thinking about moving here and asked about the locals, and after 20 of the most boring minutes of his life, finally someone mentioned something interesting. A few weeks ago, that Wilson widow hired a new woman to live with her, some man said, reining in his drunken slurring impressively. She's some. I don't even know her name. No one really sees her around town, except that one time she showed up round here with that man, Hilda's son. We don't know her name. What does she look like? Clive asked, interested. Don't know, the man said with a shrug. He licked his lips. Sure I'm thirsty. Yes sir. Sure am. Clive passed a beer to him, impatient. Hilda, Mrs. Wilson, she just showed up one day and started talkin' about this lovely woman who was livin' with her now. Some girl who sounded like she's from far away. I don't know anything about that, but that's what my wife was tellin' me. It was almost funny how easy it had been to find her after all. It had taken them weeks, but now, all it took was dropping a comment here and there. He left the man sitting at the bar without paying his tab. He did pay for his own alcohol. Clive was not going to do that to him, and got onto his horse. He rode out to the Wilson cabin since he knew exactly where it was, where apparently Sherman's wife had been hired as a live-in companion. What a pathetic job to have, especially for the woman who had been married to a man as rich and powerful as Sherman Marlow. The cabin itself was just as pathetic. Clive couldn't wait to get this business done and then get back home, where he could visit the saloons with the no doubt huge amount of money Sherman would give him for this. He wanted to shoot the stupid rickety door down, but he constrained himself. The fun would come later. He knocked on the door. An old lady answered, probably the infamous Mrs. Wilson. Hello, Clive said, his lips stretching in a dirt-smudged smile. Have you got a young lady livin' with ya? The old lady looked up at him with an utterly confused expression on her face. What? She asked. Who are you? What are you doin' here? Are you one of Mason's friends or some out-of-towner? Had Clive made a mistake? He was pretty sure he had ridden to the right spread. Was this not the right woman? You're Hilda Wilson, ain't ya? He asked, his eyes narrowing. Ah, yes, she said, nodding her head as if shaking off her confusion. Are you lookin' for Lisa, is that it? Look, the girl is kind of spooked about the outside right now, and I wouldn't want to make her more anxious, so why don't you come back later? Hilda, came a faint voice from inside the house. Who was it? She appeared at the door behind the old woman and all doubts left Clive. His eyes locked onto her menacingly. That was her all right, the pretty little woman Sherman had brought from New York and who hadn't given him one night before she started making trouble for everybody. Hey, Mrs. Marlow. Are you Lisa now? Clive asked with a sneer, taking a step forward. Is that what you are callin' yourself these days? What a stupid little name. Stella took a terrified step back, her eyes wide as saucers. Clive rested his hand on the pistol by his hip and motioned with his head toward Hilda, who was looking at both of them with fear and confusion in her eyes. "Don't try to run," Clive warned, voice low and menacing. "Or, well, let's say it's obvious this one can't run as fast as you, and my bullets are very deadly." "Don't hurt her," Stella begged of him, walking toward him. "Clive, she doesn't know anything, she hasn't done anything. I know Sherman has been looking for me. I know she took me in, but she didn't know she was hiding anybody. Please." "Oh, well, then. I won't," he said with a roll of his eyes, as if he had infinite bullets to waste on every woman who crossed his path. "I won't touch her, Stella, if you come quiet. Though I will tell ya, girl. I like you begging." "Ha." "All right," Stella said, quiet and full of fear. "You leave her alone, and I will go with you wherever you want to take me." "Lisa, what's happening?" Hilda asked, trying to grasp her arm. "Who is this man, really? Why did he call you a different name? Please, don't go. I don't want you in danger to protect me." "I'm so sorry," Stella said, tears in her eyes. "I never wanted this, but I should have known it was comin'. I did know it was coming. I'm sorry I put you in danger. I put you all in danger. But it will be all right now. You'll be just fine." Clive grabbed her arm and yanked her out the door, too impatient to allow her goodbyes. Stella cried out in pain, and his smile widened. They could all say goodbye to her at her funeral, anyway. "Stay inside and don't cause trouble," he warned the old woman, palming his pistol away. He watched with satisfaction as the color drained from her face, and she stared at him with wide eyes. He mounted his horse with Stella and rode off. Mason missed Clive by 5 minutes, if that. He rode his horse home as quickly as he could, kicking its sides to make it run faster, and when he arrived, he was in such a state that he almost fell off the horse when he tried to dismount it. He thundered into the house, frantic, his steps quick and loud as he strode around the house looking for his mother. He had lost his parents to bandits once before. The thought that it could happen again was unbearable. The thought of Lisa as an outlaw was as unbearable, but right then, his mother was his priority. She was not in the living room, and when he went to the kitchen she was not there, nor on the porch, nor anywhere. But then he found her in her room, sitting on the bed with her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking with her sobbing. Mason's heart wrenched itself in the entirely opposite direction it had been going. Had something happened to Lisa? He realized all at once that he hadn't seen her either, and she was not there in the room with his ma. He knew Lisa wouldn't have left Hilda to cry alone like this. "Ma," he said, relief at seeing she was all right making him weak in the knees. He knelt by her and took her hands gently from her face. "Ma, please, what happened? Why are you like this? Where's Lisa?" "Oh, Mason," she wailed, throwing her arms around his neck. "He took Lisa." "Who?" Mason uttered. "Who took Lisa? This man arrived and just grabbed her. I don't know where he's taking her, but I think, oh, Mason, I think he's going to kill her." "Ma, Lisa doesn't exist," he told her, wrecked. He remembered then that there was a reason someone would come and take Lisa. Her real name's Stella Marlow. I saw her on a wanted poster in the sheriff's office. She lied to us. Maybe this man who took her was the person who she must have done something to end up wanted. Hilda drew away from him, suddenly furious. She stood up. "Mason Wilson, how dare you," she hissed. "That girl's been nothing but an angel to us since she arrived. Do you really believe she would do something bad? She's the best woman I ever seen, and I thanked the Lord when you told me you were going to marry her and make her my daughter. She's not an outlaw or whoever they say she is to end up on those posters. She's in danger, Mason." "Ma, please," Mason said, his heart breaking. She knelt in front of him, taking his hands in hers. "Mason, whatever happened to Lisa, to Stella, well, she's a victim. You know that. You have to. These men drew her into something bad, and she ran away from them, and now, Lord knows what they'll do to her. You have to go get her. His mother wailed, and Mason felt like the stupidest man in the world. Kneeling there with his mother safe in his arms, knowing that Lisa's life was in danger, he couldn't imagine how he had thought Lisa was going to hurt his mother. How could he have doubted her? I'm going to get her back, he swore. Mason grabbed his pistol. But he also retrieved his rifle and walked back out to where he had left his horse. His mother stayed back in her room, too shaken to even see him off. Still, Mason had the feeling that she wouldn't be able to sit still like that for very long. She was a doer, his mother, and would soon stand and try to figure out a way to help. That, or prepare for Stella's return. His ma was a strong woman. He was about to mount his horse when he caught sight of a rapidly approaching shadow on the horizon and froze. He prepared his rifle, thankful for the range it gave him. He waited a few seconds, and relaxed once he recognized the sheriff's white mare. He got onto his own horse and rode out to meet the man. "Sheriff," he shouted once he was close enough. "Lucas," the sheriff shouted back. They rode toward each other and stopped close, their horses sniffing at each other amicably for a moment. "Lisa's been kidnapped," Mason told him, gripping his rifle even tighter. "She really is the woman from the poster, that's Stella Marlow. My mother was home when a man arrived and just took her and listened. I know she is on a poster, but..." "You shouldn't have left my office like that," the sheriff said, cross. He reached into a pocket and produced a letter, shaking it in Mason's direction. "I received this from my good friend, Sheriff James Madsen, who was murdered not 2 days after he wrote this. Here, he details his investigations into one Sherman Marlow, and how he feared for his life." Sherman Marlow? Mason thought, stricken. It was the same last name as Stella. Was Lisa, or Stella, this man's wife? Surely, she couldn't be. Mason didn't want to think about it. He had planned to make her his wife. "I suspect your Lisa is just a victim in all this," the sheriff said with a shake of his head. "I knew Marlow had been married some time ago, but didn't connect them, and now, you say she has been kidnapped?" "By some man called Clive," Mason told him, his hand tightening around the rifle until his knuckles went white. The sheriff swore. "Clive? That's the name of Sherman Marlow's right-hand man. Do you have any idea where he's gone with her? We might still save her, and we'll only be able to uncover the truth about all this if we find her. I know which direction they've gone, but I don't know where," Mason said grimly. "My mother said they went ahead on the road and then veered to the left, but there was not much to see after that. Sheriff, I don't care about Marlow. I just want to see Lisa safe. And I want to see justice for my friend," the sheriff said gruffly. "Together, we might be able to get both." Chapter 10. Mason and the sheriff found Clive and Stella not too long after, in spite of their fear of not finding them at all. The lot of outlaws were confident men who made it obvious how stupid and arrogant they really were. They were speaking loudly and drinking, giving their position away to anyone who might have been looking. Mason couldn't see much from their vantage point, but he thought that the figure he saw kneeling was Lisa. He wondered if they thought no one would come after her. Stella. He needed to get used to using her real name. He nodded to the sheriff, who nodded back. They dismounted and tied their horses nearby, careful to approach the campsite on foot so as to not give away their position. After a few moments, the picture around the fire became clearer. There were 4 men who were arguing in loud voices. The kneeling woman was indeed Stella. Her face was dirted by earth, tears tracking down her cheeks, and Mason felt fury stir in his chest. She was sitting to the right of the group, her hands bound, and her mouth gagged. She had obviously been treated less than well by these men. The thought of her left in their power, even if only for the short minutes that had passed while Mason had been searching for her, made bile rise in his throat. Mason was going to make sure this kind of thing never happened to her again. He was going to make sure Stella never, ever had cause to have any fear again. He was going to give her a life where she wouldn't be afraid to walk around town on his arm. Indeed, to walk around anywhere. I'm going to kill them, Mason hissed under his breath. I'm going to kill them for doing this to her. The sheriff put a hand on his shoulder, and they shared another look. The sheriff seemed as furious as he was, and Mason could only imagine what the man was thinking, what with his friend to grieve for and avenge on top of everything else. The two of them were outnumbered 4-2, but they did still have the element of surprise, and although none of them men seemed horribly drunk, they had been drinking. They could win this. Mason gave the sheriff a significant look and pointed at a nearby ridge overlooking the camp, then pointed at his trusty rifle. The sheriff nodded. Mason quickly and stealthily moved to the place, settling down with his gun. Though his heart was thundering, his hands were steady. He had been a bounty hunter 10 years now. He knew how to take a shot like no one else, and this was a very good vantage point, as if made for him. And he had a perfect line of vision on Stella. The sheriff approached slowly and cautiously, his guns drawn. It wouldn't do to let the men see him before he was close enough to do anything, and though the man shouldn't have been able to get quite so close, he somehow managed to do it. After a few tense moments, the men's voices rang out a bit louder, just enough for Mason to hear. His blood ran cold. They were arguing over whether to kill the woman right then or wait. He knew what option this sort of men always chose. Sherman drew his pistol and turned menacingly to Stella, a terrible smirk on his face. This was a man who thought he had been wronged, and who would take great pleasure in punishing the one who had wronged him. He was a tall, heavy man who loomed even when Stella stood perfectly straight beside him, and the sight of him standing in front of her while she cowered on the ground was terrifying. Stella was not a proud woman. She was choked by fear, and she cowered before him, curling herself up to make herself as small as she could. She would shed more tears, but she had cried so much already. Her eyes were dry. They hurt. What a husband to have, she thought a bit hysterically. Maybe this was all for the best. She somehow knew that it would end up like this no matter what. Him with a gun to her head. He was just that sort of man. Did you really think you could hide from me? Sherman asked, spitting the words out and waving his pistol around. The other three men laughed, tipsy enough that everything was hilarious. They would enjoy a good show, cowards and scum the lot of them. I put a bounty on your head, you stupid girl. It's a pity you're worth more to me dead than alive. You should have listened to your husband and stayed in the saloon with me. Look where it's gotten all of us. Another woman might have had a clever reply for him, but Stella's tongue was made of lead inside her mouth. She looked up at him with wide, imploring eyes. Even if she hadn't been gagged, she wouldn't have had an answer for him. Please, God, she thought fervently, let me live. If she'd had her mouth free, she would have begged. She wanted to live. Poor Hilda, who would again be left alone. Her poor father, oh, her father. He would lose her, too, lose all he had left of his family, of his life. Stella almost closed her eyes. She didn't want to think of him. It's such a waste. Such a pity, really, Sherman crooned, squatting in front of her. She drew her face away from the foul breath he was puffing out over her face, but she had no way to dislodge the fingers he used to grip her jaw and bring her closer to him. She was glad, suddenly, fiercely, that she hadn't given herself to him, that her body remained only hers. While she had made many mistakes, this had been something she had done right. Such a waste, with how pretty you are. You would have made a fine wife if you had obeyed. You could have given me good sons and beautiful daughters. You could still do it, mind, but really, I think you're more trouble than you're worth. I might as well answer another advert and get another bright young thing, one that will not be as stupid as you. I don't know if I will be able to find one as pretty as you are, Stella, my dear wife, but, really, I can't let you live. Stella drew what she thought was her last breath and closed her eyes. He had his gun in his hand. She knew what was coming next. This was all she could give herself, the dignity of not letting him see the fear plain in her eyes when he blew out her head. A shot rang out. Stella waited for the pain. She waited for the blood and the cold and the fear and the nothingness that would follow, so terrified, she was cold with it. But none of it came. What came was a blood-curdling scream that made her eyes snap open just in time to watch as Sherman dropped his gun to the ground and brought his blood-soaked hand to his chest. She stared at him, disbelieving, then looked out. Who had shot him? Someone had shot him in the hand that held the gun he was about to use to murder her. Who had saved her life? A man Stella didn't know approached. He was older with a gray mustache and graying hair under a big hat, and his badge told her he was the sheriff. Sheriff Lucas Simon, she remembered suddenly. Hilda had mentioned him sometimes. She'd caught a glimpse of him the one time she'd gone out with Mason. The sight of him was such a relief that she would have dropped to the ground if only she were not already there. "Drop your weapons," the sheriff shouted harshly, his knuckles white around his pistol. And yet, squinting at it, Stella had a sudden thought that it hadn't been him who had fired. Was she a fool, or was there someone else around? "Now. You are under arrest for the murder of Sheriff James Madsen and the kidnapping of this young woman. If you don't drop your weapons, be assured that they will be dropped anyway when I shoot you all dead." Stella's eyes filled with tears, her mouth dropping open. The sheriff was arresting Sherman. He knew the truth. Stella closed her eyes tightly and sent up a fervent prayer. God was with her. God had sent this man to her. She opened them again and watched as the men, one by one, cussing and half-drunk, laid down their weapons, Sherman with a decidedly apoplectic look on his face. It was somehow hilarious and satisfying. His hand was still bleeding. Stella wished suddenly that he would lose it. All the men stood unarmed, except Clive. Stella tried to shout, but it came out muffled through her gag. She watched helplessly as Clive lifted his gun, his finger on the trigger, and aimed it at the poor sheriff. Another shot rang out from the ridge above the camp, and Clive dropped to the ground with a bullet wound to the chest, heavy like a rock. Stella's heart was in her throat. Who else was out there? She hadn't been wrong after all. Who had pulled the trigger just now? Could it be who she thought it was, who she hoped against hope it would be? Could Mason have come for her even though he knew she had been lying all along? Surely, he had gone home, and Hilda had told him of how Clive took her. Would Mason be here out of a sense of duty for his mother, or was he here for her? When the other two men scrambled to reach for their dropped pistols, the sheriff got the draw on them and finally, all of them gave up and were captured. As soon as the men dropped their weapons again, Mason lowered his and took off running. He dashed to the sheriff's side and then further, dropping to his knees and skidding to Stella's side. The woman was clearly shocked, her eyes were wide, and she was trembling like a sapling during a hurricane. When she looked at Mason, she started to cry. "Lisa, Stella," Mason said. "I'm so sorry, so sorry. Here, let me." He untied the gag from around her mouth and reached back to untie her hands. He knew he shouldn't touch her if she didn't want him to, that he shouldn't do this, but it was impossible not to hold her. He wound his arms around her to reach back to her hands, keeping her safe between his arms. He nestled her to his chest. Stella let out a long breath, pressed her forehead into his shoulder, and started to weep. "I'm sorry we took so long," Mason said helplessly, hugging her to him. He buried his nose in her hair, uncaring right then and there that there were other men around, that she was married, that he shouldn't. He loved her. He had to hold her. "You came," Stella said, her voice weak. "Of course, I came," Mason said. "I will come anytime anyone's giving you trouble. I swear. I will come for you every time, no matter what." He felt Stella smiling against his shoulder. "I sure hope there won't be any other times like this." "And Mason? I can have my marriage annulled." Mason laughed out loud. Chapter 11. When Mason brought Stella home, and it really was home, properly and honestly, now that they knew who she was and were welcoming her back anyway. Hilda was out the door as soon as she heard the horses galloping. She had worked herself into a mess, Stella realized. She looked like she wanted to run out to meet them but had aggravated her knees too much to be able to do it. Stella imagined Hilda pacing around the house, anxious about her, and felt warmth infuse her chest. Mason helped her dismount the horse, his hand rough but gentle on her. Stella kept her hand in his as they made their way into the house. Maybe she shouldn't, but she thought that no one in the world would be able to pry her apart from Mason right then and there. He had come to save her. "Lisa," Hilda cried when she got close enough, wrestling Stella into a tight hug. "Oh, girl, don't you ever do that to me again. I'm an old woman. I can't bear this kind of thing. Oh, I thought I was going to die." "Me, too," Stella thought, but was too kind to say it. She hugged Hilda back, closing her eyes and inhaling the scent of pastry clinging to her. Hilda had been to the kitchen. Stella realized suddenly how hungry she was. "My name is Stella," she told her softly. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Hilda. I've lied to you." "You tell me everything," Hilda said, drawing away, but keeping her hands on Stella's arms. "You tell me everything, you hear that? After we eat something. I'm not going to make you spew anything right now, girl. I have more sense than that. Come on, I've made your favorite." "All right," Stella said, thankful and relieved. They all sat around the kitchen table and ate strudel, which hadn't been Stella's favorite before Hilda had named it so. Stella would call it so in the future after all that had happened. Stella didn't take Mason's hand again, but they caught each other's eyes often enough. She sat and told them her story. She spoke of her mother's illness and her death, the bakery and her lonely, quiet father. She spoke of how desperate she had been to keep the bakery afloat in the city she loved, how she couldn't bear to part with her father but couldn't bear the thought of her mother's bakery being sold and destroyed. She spoke of finding Sherman, of their deal, of coming to Texas with him. She spoke of what she had seen, and how she had run. By the time she was finished, Mason had given up on the dessert to hold her hand between both of his, and Hilda was weeping softly. "I'm so sorry, girl," Hilda said. "No one should go through any of that. I hope you've liked it here, girl. I suppose, are you going to go back to your father now?" Stella froze. She started, unsure. She stole a glance at Mason, who was frowning at his mother. "I don't know. I'm sorry for staying in your house so long." "None of that," Hilda snapped. "You know you're welcome here for as long as you like, Lisa, Stella. And if you want to keep on living here and earning your wages as my companion, then I'd be the happiest woman around. Don't go thinking I asked because I want you to leave, okay? I asked because I want to know if you're going back to your father now that you can." I don't know," Stella said, looking down at her lap. The three of them were quiet for a moment. "You said you're the one who wanted to keep the bakery," Mason said, hesitant. "If your father is not happy there anymore, and if it was me, I wouldn't be happy with my daughter so far away. Do you think he'd like to come live here at the ranch? There's plenty of work to be had around, even if he can't do heavy work. If nothing else, he can cook and spare Ma's knees once and for all." Stella looked up at him with bright eyes, and slowly a smile broke across her face. 2 weeks later, Stella's name was officially cleared. Sherman was found guilty for conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to hanging. Stella didn't want to think about any of that business, content to go on with her life as if it were not happening, but Mason walked around the ranch for a week afterward as if he were the happiest man in the world. Late one afternoon, Mason walked in the door with a smile on his face and headed straight to Stella where she was sitting on the couch, sewing. He sat down beside her, closer than normal, and Stella looked away with heat in her cheeks. "Stella," he said, "you won't believe it. While I was out buying supplies, Sheriff Simon asked me to pop by his office, 'cause he wanted to talk to me. And guess what?" "What?" His smile widened. "We just got the 1,000 from your bounty." Stella stared at him, shocked. "What? Why? But that makes no sense." "I did bring you to the authorities, didn't I?" he asked with a laugh. "Oh, but..." "In truth, it was for Sherman Marlow," Mason told her, shaking his head. They gave me the bounty as if it had been for him instead, and we did play a big part in helping the sheriff bring him to justice. I didn't do much helping, Stella murmured. Mason put a hand on her arm and squeezed. But you did. Don't think about it, though. Not anymore. It's over. We should celebrate. Oh, good thing we have cause to celebrate, came an amused voice from the kitchen, rapidly approaching. When Mason and Stella looked up, Stella's father was standing by them with a smile on his face. Hello, daughter. I plan to make pies for this celebration. Lots and lots of pies. Mason and Stella smiled. Stella jumped up and caught her father's hand, leaning against his side for a moment. She was so happy to be around him again that she could burst from it. She could burst from how happy she was in general. She had loved the bakery and a part of her still cried at the thought of it in someone else's hands, but her mother was gone. Keeping the bakery wouldn't bring her back. This was home, here and now in Pine Ridge, with Mason and Hilda and her father, all on the same ranch. Though her father was indeed a bit too old and too unused to hard work to help Mason with the ranch, he was working wonders with Hilda at the kitchen. Between the two of them, Stella wouldn't be surprised if they ended up opening something or other in town someday. For the first time in many months, Stella looked forward to the future. She didn't know, but as soon as her father had arrived in Pine Ridge, Mason had asked him for her hand in marriage. He waited until he received the money from the bounty to buy a ring, and later that afternoon, after the pies had been baked and eaten and the elders had retired to sleep, he held her hand and pulled her out to the porch. To the sound of the breeze in the trees and the light of the yellow lamps, he knelt and proposed. Epilogue. Mason, Stella called out. Hilda is a skin for you. Come in for just a second. Mason looked up from the horses he was tending. Stella was standing in the sun with little Mason holding onto her dress and Annie held on her hip, the boy anxious and the girl curious about the world. Mason smiled at them and patted the horses once more before taking off toward his dear family. He swung his son high in his arms, where the boy finally relaxed enough to peer around happily. Mason wound his other arm around his wife's waist. What does she want? He asked. Don't know, Stella said, tilting her chin up. Probably she just wants to see you, you've been out here all day. Let her feed you some, then you can get back at it. Mason tilted his head down and obliged her with a kiss, their lips locking together sweetly. All right, he said. I'm not goin' to say no to spendin' some time with my kin in the shade. Then let's go inside, Stella said softly, and they walked into the house together. The end. Thank you for listening to this heartwarming story by Susannah Calloway. You can be assured that all her books are clean and wholesome. To find other romances by Susannah Calloway, as well as the other authors at Tika House Publishing, visit www.tikahousepublishing.com. Remember to hit like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next Susannah Calloway Western romance.